A man with nothing but a mop, a thermos, and a heart too big for his own good walks straight into a moment that will change everything. It starts as a small act of kindness on a winter night. But behind that quiet thank you hides a truth no one dares to say out loud. She's not just the new intern. She's the boss's only daughter. And the man who helped her? He's first in line to lose his job. One secret. One act of courage. And a choice that could destroy a family or save a man's future. When loyalty collides with compassion, how far would you go to protect the person who once saved you? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jack Rourke guided his mop bucket through the empty hallways of Renshaw Manufacturing. His footsteps echoed in the silent building, mixing with the gentle squeak of the bucket's wheels. At this hour, just past midnight, he was alone with his thoughts and the endless stretch of floors that needed cleaning. Jack paused near a large window, leaning against his mop handle. Outside, snow drifted lazily under the orange glow of the street lamps, coating the parking lot in a pristine white blanket. The sight reminded him of Emily's excitement earlier that day when she spotted the first flakes falling during breakfast. "Look, Dad," she had exclaimed, pressing her nose against their kitchen window. "Maybe we'll have enough for a snowman tomorrow." A small smile tugged at his lips as he reached for his phone. Its screen slightly cracked from the time he dropped it while rushing to get Emily's inhaler. He pulled up his photo gallery, thumbing past dozens of pictures until he found his favorite Emily at the park last summer, her gap-toothed grin wide as she held up a dandelion puff. The image blurred slightly as exhaustion crept into his eyes. 2 jobs meant he averaged about 5 hours of sleep these days, but bills didn't pay themselves. Mrs. Henderson from next door was staying with Emily tonight, like she did during his night shifts. The elderly woman refused to accept more than $20 a night, saying Emily's company was payment enough. Jack slipped the phone back into his pocket and resumed his work, pushing the mop in long, methodical strokes across the floor. The routine was familiar after 3 years at Renshaw. Start at the north entrance, work his way through accounting, then marketing, finish with the executive wing. Every surface had to shine by morning when the office workers arrived in their pressed suits and polished shoes. His shoulders ached as he worked, a reminder of his years at the factory before the layoffs. That job had paid better, offered better benefits too. But manufacturing jobs were scarce now, and a widowed father couldn't afford to be picky. The janitorial position at Renshaw had been a lifeline, even if the pay barely covered the basics. He thought about the stack of bills waiting at home. Emily's asthma medication, the rent increase notice, the heating bill that always spiked in winter. The envelope of carefully clipped coupons sat on his kitchen counter, organized by expiration date. Every penny counted when you were stretching a single income to support a growing child. The break room was his next stop. Jack propped open the door with his foot and wheeled in his cleaning supplies. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixed with the remnants of someone's microwaved lunch. He made his way to the industrial refrigerator, opening it to check on the red thermos he'd placed there earlier. Inside, the chicken soup he'd made yesterday waited for Emily's lunch tomorrow. She loved his soup, said it was even better than Mom's had been. The recipe was simple: chicken, carrots, celery, and tiny star-shaped pasta that made Emily smile. He'd learned to cook out of necessity after Sarah passed, but there was love in every meal he prepared for his daughter. Jack closed the fridge and turned his attention to the break room tables. The surface was dotted with coffee rings and scattered crumbs, evidence of a busy workday. He sprayed each table with cleaning solution, wiping them down with practiced efficiency. The chairs needed straightening, the microwave needed wiping, and the coffee maker needed a thorough cleaning. As he polished the last table to a shine, a sound caught his attention. It was faint at first, barely audible over the building's heating system, but it grew clearer. Someone crying in the corner office lounge. The muffled sobs grew clearer as Jack approached the staff lounge. He hesitated at the doorway, not wanting to intrude on someone's private moment. Through the glass panel, he could make out a young woman sitting alone at one of the round tables, her shoulders shaking slightly. Jack knew he should probably continue with his work and give her space. But something about her reminded him of the times he'd found Emily crying in her room, missing her mom. He couldn't walk away from that sound, not when it carried such familiar pain. He pushed the door open slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible enough not to startle her. The woman quickly straightened up, hastily wiping at her face with the sleeve of her expensive-looking blazer. She couldn't have been much older than 25, her makeup smeared beneath red-rimmed eyes. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, turning away and wrapping her fingers around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. "I'll be out of your way in a minute." Jack noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she tried to compose herself. "No rush," he said softly, his voice gentle from years of calming childhood fears. "The lounge is open to everyone." She attempted a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Please, I'm fine. You can go ahead and clean. I don't want to hold up your work." Instead of leaving, Jack thought about the thermos of homemade chicken soup he'd prepared for Emily's lunch tomorrow. Without hesitation, he walked to the staff refrigerator and retrieved it. The soup was still warm. He'd made it fresh before his shift started. "Here," he said, placing the thermos on the table and sliding it toward her. "My grandmother always said hot soup fixes everything. Well, most things anyway." The young woman stared at the thermos, then up at Jack, confusion evident on her tear-stained face. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "I insist," Jack said, already unscrewing the cap. The aromatic steam of chicken, vegetables, and herbs filled the space between them. "It's better than cold coffee." She seemed to war with herself for a moment, manners fighting against need. Finally, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the cup portion of the thermos as Jack poured the soup. I'm Sophie." "Jack," he replied simply, not pressing for details she clearly didn't want to share. He watched as she took a tentative sip, then a longer one, some color returning to her pale cheeks. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the quiet sounds of soup being savored. Jack busied himself with wiping down the nearby counter, giving her space while staying close enough to be reassuring. "This is really good," Sophie said after a while, her voice steadier now. "Did you make it yourself?" Jack nodded, wringing out his cleaning cloth. "My daughter's favorite recipe. She thinks it makes everything better, too." "She's right," Sophie managed a genuine, if small, smile this time. She started to say something else but stopped herself, instead focusing on the soup with unusual intensity. After she'd finished about half the thermos, Jack gathered his cleaning supplies. He'd delayed his rounds long enough, and the third floor still needed attention before his shift ended. "Keep it," he said when Sophie tried to return the thermos. "You can leave it at the front desk tomorrow." "But your daughter's lunch." "I've got more at home," Jack assured her, though it wasn't entirely true. He'd make another batch before Emily woke up. It wouldn't be the first time he'd gone without sleep to take care of his little girl. Sometimes we all need a little soup for the soul. Sophie's eyes welled up again, but this time they weren't tears of distress. "Thank you, Jack. Really?" He gave her a small nod and headed back to his mop bucket in the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building once more. It wasn't until he reached the door that he glanced back, catching Sophie watching him leave with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and wonder. As Jack wheeled his bucket toward the elevator, he didn't give the encounter much more thought. In his experience, kindness wasn't something that needed to be analyzed or explained. Sometimes people just needed a warm bowl of soup and a moment of quiet companionship. He'd learned that much from raising Emily alone. The night stretched ahead of him, floors to mop and trash bins to empty. He went back to humming softly, thinking about tomorrow's grocery list, and whether he could squeeze in another hour of overtime this week. The world kept turning, and Jack Rourke kept working, unaware that his simple act of kindness had just set larger wheels in motion. Sophie remained in the lounge, her hands wrapped around the thermos, staring at the door where the kind janitor had disappeared. The soup had warmed more than just her insides. It had touched something deeper, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about this company and the people within it. The winter sun hadn't risen yet when Jack pulled into the employee parking lot the next morning. His old pickup truck groaned as he turned off the engine, the sound echoing in the empty lot. He sat for a moment, warming his hands with his breath. The dashboard clock showed 5:45 a.m. Plenty of time to get the main areas cleaned before the day shift arrived. Grabbing his worn leather lunch bag, Jack made his way through the service entrance. The building felt different in these early hours, peaceful, like a sleeping giant waiting to wake up. His footsteps echoed down the empty corridors as he headed to the maintenance office to clock in. "Did you hear about the new intern?" A woman's voice drifted from around the corner. Jack slowed his pace, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a private conversation. He recognized the voices, Karen and Diane from accounting, always first in the office, and usually first with the latest gossip. "The young one? Sophie?" Diane whispered back. "That's her, the CEO's daughter." Jack's hand froze on the doorknob to the maintenance office. His mind flashed back to the crying woman from last night, hunched over her coffee cup. "Mr. Renshaw's keeping it quiet." Karen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's working from the bottom up, learning the business. Started in the mailroom last week." "Smart girl," Diane replied. "Though I heard Matthews in shipping made her cry yesterday. Can you imagine? Yelling at the boss's daughter?" Jack's stomach tightened. He remembered Sophie's tear-stained face, how small she'd looked in that moment. The soup he'd given her, his daughter's lunch, suddenly felt like a presumptuous gesture. "That's why she's here so early," Karen said. "Trying to prove herself, I guess. Must be hard being the CEO's kid." Their voices faded as they walked toward the elevator. Jack stood there for a long moment, processing what he'd heard. Sophie Renshaw, daughter of Richard Renshaw, the man whose name was on every paycheck, every company letter, every building directory. The same Sophie he'd found crying over a cold cup of coffee. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as break-room gossip. People always needed something to talk about, and a secret CEO's daughter made for good entertainment. Still, something about it rang true. The way she'd been reluctant to share details about herself. How she'd seemed out of place in the office that late at night. Jack went through his morning routine mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He checked his phone. A text from Mrs. Martinez next door confirmed she'd gotten Emily on the school bus okay. At least, that was one less worry. The building gradually came to life around him as he worked. The heating system hummed to full power. Elevator doors began their regular rhythm of opening and closing, and the sound of arriving employees filled the halls. Jack kept his head down, focusing on his tasks. He had the West Wing floors to finish before the morning meeting started. As he pushed his cart past the cafeteria, a familiar voice called out, "Good morning!" Jack looked up to see Sophie standing by the coffee machine, giving him a friendly wave. She looked different in the morning light, more composed, wearing a crisp blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. Gone was any trace of last night's tears, replaced by a warm smile that reached her eyes. His chest tightened with uncertainty. If the gossip was true, she was worlds away from his position in life. The soup, the quiet conversation, it felt different now, weighted with implications he hadn't considered. Jack managed a polite nod, just enough to acknowledge her greeting without encouraging further interaction. He quickly turned his cart toward the maintenance closet, eager to retreat to the familiar comfort of his routine. As he walked away, he could feel Sophie's eyes on him, but he didn't look back. The maintenance closet beckoned like a sanctuary, a place where things made sense, where he knew exactly who he was and what was expected of him. Inside those walls, he wasn't a widowed janitor who'd accidentally befriended the CEO's daughter. He was just Jack, doing his job, keeping the floors clean, and earning his pay to take care of Emily. The door of the maintenance closet clicked shut behind him, and Jack leaned against it, letting out a long breath. The familiar smell of cleaning supplies and old mops surrounded him. Here, among the bottles of floor cleaner and rolls of paper towels, the morning's revelations felt distant, almost unreal. He pulled out his phone and looked at his background photo. Emily's gap-toothed smile beaming back at him. This was his reality. Everything else was just background noise, he told himself. Just another day at Renshaw Manufacturing, where he had a job to do and a daughter to support. The morning maintenance checklist sat on the shelf, waiting to be filled out. Jack picked up his pencil, ready to lose himself in the familiar routine of his work. He had floors to mop, trash to collect, and bathrooms to clean. Simple, straightforward tasks that didn't come with complicated social implications. Through the small window in the maintenance closet door, he could see people streaming into the building now, clutching coffee cups and briefcases, heading to their offices and cubicles. Among them, Sophie's figure disappeared into the crowd, just another employee starting their workday. Or at least, that's what she was trying to be, Jack thought. Maybe that's why she'd been crying last night. The weight of being Richard Renshaw's daughter while trying to prove herself on her own terms. He understood something about carrying weights that others couldn't see. But it wasn't his problem to solve. He had enough on his plate keeping this job and providing for Emily. Jack picked up his cleaning supplies and headed back out into the corridor. He had work to do, and that's what he would focus on. Nothing more, nothing less. The sound of his mop hitting the floor echoed through the hallway as he resumed his morning routine. One more day, one more dollar, he thought to himself. That's all this needed to be. The vending machine's front panel lay open as Jack knelt before it, his toolbox spread across the floor. His fingers worked methodically, checking connections and testing springs. A crumpled dollar bill, the culprit behind the machine's latest tantrum, sat on top of his toolbox, finally freed from its metal prison. "Does it eat money often?" a soft voice asked from behind him. Jack turned to find Sophie standing there, holding 2 paper-wrapped sandwiches. Her eyes were clear today, no trace of yesterday's tears, though she looked a bit nervous. "Often enough to keep me busy," he replied, turning back to the machine. "Though this one's usually better behaved than the one in the East Wing. That one's got a real appetite for $5 bills." A small laugh escaped Sophie. "I brought you lunch," she said, holding out one of the sandwiches. "To thank you for the soup yesterday. It really helped." Jack hesitated, his weathered hands pausing over the machine's innards. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." She placed the sandwich on his toolbox, careful to avoid the scattered screwdrivers. "It's turkey and Swiss. Nothing fancy, but the deli downstairs makes good bread." "Thank you," Jack said quietly, surprised by the gesture. He reached for a rag to wipe the machine grease from his hands. Sophie settled onto a nearby chair, unwrapping her own sandwich. "Have you worked here long?" "Going on 3 years now." Jack closed the vending machine's panel with practiced ease, checking that it locked properly. "Since the factory where I used to work closed down." "That must have been tough," Sophie said, her voice gentle. Jack shrugged, gathering his tools. "Work is work. This place has good heating, at least. Unlike my old spot, you could see your breath in there during snowstorms." "Like the one they're predicting for tonight?" Sophie took a bite of her sandwich, looking genuinely interested. "Probably not that bad. Weather folks always make it sound worse than it is." Jack finally sat down, unwrapping his sandwich. The bread was indeed fresh, still slightly warm. "Though my daughter's hoping for enough snow to cancel school tomorrow." Sophie's eyes brightened. "You have a daughter?" "Emily," Jack said, a small smile softening his features. "She's 8. Thinks snow days were invented just for her." "I used to think the same thing," Sophie laughed. "I grew up in Michigan. Every winter storm felt like a personal gift." "Michigan? That explains it. You're used to real snow." Jack took another bite, savoring the simple luxury of a fresh deli sandwich. "This is good. Thank you again." "It's the least I could do." Sophie brushed some crumbs from her skirt. "Would you mind if I walked with you on your rounds? I should learn more about the building, and you seem to know every corner of it." Jack studied her for a moment, wondering about her interest. But there was something earnest in her expression that made him nod. "Sure, though it's not very exciting. Just checking supply closets and making sure nothing's falling apart." They finished their sandwiches as Jack led the way through the building's maze-like corridors. Sophie asked questions about everything: the age of the building, which areas needed the most maintenance, how he kept track of all the different keys on his ring. "Each floor has its own color code," he explained, showing her the small plastic tags. "Blue for basement, green for ground floor, and so on. Helps when you're half asleep at 3 a.m. and something needs fixing." "That happens often?" "Often enough. Pipes don't care what time it is when they decide to burst." He stopped to check a storage closet, making note of cleaning supplies running low. "Though my worst call was for a raccoon in the CEO's office last summer. That was an interesting night." Sophie's eyes widened. "A raccoon? How did it get in?" "Through the ventilation system. Smart little guy. He'd figured out how to push the ceiling tiles aside." Jack allowed himself a small grin at the memory. Took me 2 hours to convince him that the parking lot was a better dinner spot than the executive suite. Sophie's laughter echoed in the empty hallway. Did you ever tell anyone about it? Didn't need to. The security cameras caught the whole thing, though I heard the morning cleaning crew had some questions about the tiny paw prints all over the mahogany desk. They continued their walk, Sophie matching his steady pace. Jack found himself pointing out things he'd never shared with anyone. The corner where the sunrise made the old wooden panels glow like honey. The hidden alcove where he sometimes ate lunch on rainy days. The window that gave the best view of downtown's Christmas lights. As they reached the marketing department, Sophie checked her watch and sighed. I should get back to my desk. But she hesitated, then smiled. Would it be okay if I brought you coffee tomorrow? There's this little cafe around the corner that makes the best hazelnut blend. Jack shifted his weight, uncomfortable with another offering. You don't have to. I want to, she interrupted gently. Besides, I've really enjoyed learning about the building. Maybe you could tell me more about that troublemaking vending machine in the East Wing? Looking at her hopeful expression, Jack felt his resistance softening. All right, but nothing fancy. Regular coffee is fine. Deal. Sophie's smile brightened. See you tomorrow, Jack. She turned and hurried back toward her desk, her footsteps quick and light against the polished floor. Jack watched her go, then shook his head slightly and reached for his ring of keys. There were still 3 more supply closets to check before his shift ended, and that burst pipe in the basement wouldn't fix itself. But as he worked, he found himself wondering what stories he might share tomorrow over a cup of coffee. The key scraped in the lock as Jack pushed open the door to apartment 3B. The smell of crayons and grape juice welcomed him home, Emily's after-school snack. Their small kitchen glowed with the warm light of the setting sun filtering through worn curtains. Daddy! Emily's bright voice carried from the kitchen table, where she sat surrounded by math worksheets and colored pencils. Her dark ponytail bounced as she looked up, her smile lighting up her whole face. There's my girl. Jack hung his coat by the door, his tired shoulders relaxing at the sight of her. How's the homework coming along? Almost done. Emily held up her paper proudly. Miss Turner says I'm getting better at fractions. Jack crossed to the kitchen table, ruffling her hair as he passed. That's my smart cookie. Ready for some dinner? Can we have grilled cheese? Emily's eyes sparkled with hope. With the crusty bread? You read my mind, kiddo. Jack pulled out their cast-iron skillet, a wedding gift from years ago, and the loaf of sourdough he'd found on sale yesterday. How about tomato soup, too? Yes, please. Emily returned to her fractions, her pencil scratching against paper while Jack gathered ingredients. Did you make any new friends at work today, Daddy? Jack paused, butter knife hovering over bread. Sophie's laugh echoed in his memory. Actually, someone really liked the soup I made yesterday. Emily giggled, looking up from her homework. Was it the chicken noodle? That's the best one. Sure was. Jack smiled, laying cheese slices on the bread. A new friend at work was having a rough day, so I shared some. Like when you make me soup when I'm sick? Emily's voice grew softer, and Jack heard the slight wheeze in her breath that always made his heart clench. Just like that. He glanced at her inhaler on the counter, making a mental note to check how many doses remained. The prescription refill receipt lay buried under a stack of bills by the phone, another worry for later. Speaking of which, did you use your inhaler after school today? Emily nodded, her ponytail swaying. Miss Carmen reminded me. She said it was good I remembered to bring it to aftercare. That's my responsible girl. The butter sizzled as Jack laid the sandwiches in the pan. How about you clear those books away while I finish up here? Emily gathered her papers, careful to keep them in order just like he'd taught her. The sound of her sock feet padding across their worn linoleum mixed with the gentle bubbling of heating soup. Jack watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting how she moved a little slower than usual. Winter always made her asthma worse. Daddy? Emily asked as she climbed back into her chair. Was your new friend sad? Is that why they needed soup? Jack flipped the sandwiches, golden brown and crispy. Sometimes grown-ups have hard days too, sweetheart. Just like when you felt better after sharing your crayons with Katie when she was crying at school. And now Katie's my best friend, Emily beamed. Maybe your soup friend will be your best friend too. Jack chuckled, sliding the grilled cheese onto plates. Maybe so, Cookie. Maybe so. He ladled steaming soup into their mismatched bowls. Emily's favorite had dancing penguins around the rim. Careful now, it's hot. They ate together, Emily chattering about her day, the story they read in class, the picture she drew at aftercare, how she helped her friend Tommy remember his multiplication tables. Jack listened, savoring each bite of his sandwich and every word from his daughter's mouth. "Can I have more soup?" Emily asked, holding up her empty penguin bowl. "Let's wait a few minutes," Jack said gently. "Remember what Dr. Martinez said about eating too fast with your breathing?" Emily nodded seriously. "Small bites, slow breaths." "That's right." Jack reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Tell me more about that story from class while we wait." After dinner, Jack watched Emily brush her teeth and change into her favorite star-patterned pajamas. Her breathing seemed steady, but he kept his ears tuned for any change as she climbed into bed. "Will you tell your soup friend thank you?" Emily asked as Jack tucked her blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you? For what, Cookie?" "For making you smile more." Emily yawned, snuggling deeper into her pillow. "You smiled lots when you talked about them at dinner." Jack's heart squeezed in his chest. Trust his 8-year-old to notice things he hadn't even realized himself. "I'll tell them," he promised softly. "Good." Emily's eyes were already drifting closed. "Love you, Daddy." "Love you too, sweetheart." Jack kissed her forehead and turned on her small nightlight, a warm glow against the darkness. Back in the kitchen, he faced the stack of bills waiting on the counter. Electric, heat, rent, all manageable, if tight. But Emily's prescription refill receipt made his stomach knot. The insurance copay had gone up again. He'd have to pick up extra shifts somewhere, maybe see if the hardware store needed weekend help. Jack sank into a kitchen chair, the day's exhaustion finally catching up with him. Emily's homework papers still sat in a neat pile at the edge of the table. On top was her math worksheet, covered in careful calculations and starred with a red pen. His daughter's determination, her bright spirit despite everything, it made his chest ache with pride and worry all at once. In the quiet apartment, with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, Jack allowed himself a moment to remember Sophie's smile today. The way she'd listened so intently to his stories about the building's quirks. It had been nice having someone to talk to during his rounds, even if it couldn't last. The bills seemed to stare at him from the counter, a reminder of all his responsibilities. With a deep breath, Jack pushed himself up from the chair. Tomorrow would come early enough. For now, Emily was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and strong. In the end, that was all that really mattered. Jack balanced on the stepladder, unscrewing another flickering fluorescent tube from the hallway ceiling. The early morning quiet wrapped around him like a comfortable blanket. This was his favorite time, just him and the steady rhythm of maintenance work. "Need a hand up there?" The familiar voice made him glance down. Sophie stood at the base of his ladder, 2 steaming paper cups in her hands. Her cream-colored blazer looked expensive, but her smile was warm and unpretentious. "Careful with those," Jack warned, climbing down. "Wouldn't want you spilling coffee on that nice outfit." "One's for you." She held out a cup. "Black, 2 sugars. I remembered from yesterday." Jack accepted it with a surprised, "Thanks," the warmth seeping into his work-worn hands. "You didn't have to do that." "Consider it payment for being my tour guide." Sophie's eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She looked around at the quiet hallway. "Mind if I tag along again? These morning rounds of yours are way more interesting than staring at spreadsheets." Jack shrugged, already moving to the next light fixture. "Suit yourself. But changing light bulbs isn't exactly thrilling entertainment." Sophie followed, holding his coffee while he climbed back up. Better than listening to Trevor from accounting explain pivot tables for the 100th time. A comfortable silence settled between them as Jack worked. Sophie handed him fresh bulbs, asking occasional questions about the building's maintenance. Her genuine interest surprised him. Most people treated him like part of the furniture. "My father would probably have a fit if he saw me now," Sophie said suddenly, her voice softer. "He has very specific ideas about appropriate activities for someone in my position." Jack pretended not to notice her slip. "Strict guy." "The strictest." She sighed, leaning against the wall. "Everything has to be done his way." The right schools, the right internships, the right career path. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, you know? Jack climbed down again, studying her troubled expression. What would you rather be doing? Something that matters. Sophie's eyes lit up. Something that actually helps people. I volunteered at a community center during college, teaching kids to read, helping seniors with their phones. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt real. Jack nodded, understanding perfectly. My Sarah was like that, he said, surprising himself by mentioning his wife. Always finding ways to help folks, even when we barely had 2 nickels to rub together. Sophie's expression softened. Tell me about her. Jack moved to the next light, but found himself sharing a memory he hadn't thought about in years. There was this homeless guy who used to hang around our neighborhood. Sarah would pack extra sandwiches every morning, leave them where he could find them. Never made a big deal about it. Just did what needed doing. She sounds wonderful, Sophie said quietly. She was. Jack focused on the light fixture, his throat tight. Emily has that same heart. Last week she gave her lunch money to a classmate who forgot theirs. Didn't even think twice about it. Sophie smiled. Like father, like daughter. Nah, Jack waved off the compliment. I'm just the maintenance man. You're selling yourself short. Sophie's tone was gentle but firm. That soup you shared? Most people wouldn't have bothered. They wouldn't have even noticed someone was upset. Jack felt his ears grow warm. He busied himself with the ladder. Speaking of maintenance, these lights won't change themselves. Sophie let him deflect, falling into an easy pattern of passing tools and making small talk. They discussed the unseasonably cold weather, argued good-naturedly about the best pizza place in town, and swapped stories about their favorite childhood books. An hour passed quickly. When Sophie's phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, she looked genuinely disappointed. I should go. Quarterly reports won't review themselves. Thanks for the coffee, Jack said, meaning it. And the company. Sophie gathered her things, then paused. Same time tomorrow? I'll be here. Someone's got to keep these lights burning. She laughed, bright and genuine, before heading toward the conference room. At the door, she turned and waved, her smile lingering. Jack watched her disappear into the meeting, thinking how strange life could be. Here he was, sharing coffee and conversation with the CEO's daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world. He shook his head and turned back to his work, but found himself humming as he climbed the ladder once more. The cafeteria buzzed with nervous energy as employees filed in for the mandatory staff meeting. Metal chairs scraped against linoleum floors, while workers settled around the circular tables, their morning coffee cups creating rings on the cheap plastic surfaces. Jack stood near the back wall, feeling out of place in his gray maintenance uniform among the sea of business casual attire. He'd just finished his night shift, but stayed when his supervisor insisted all staff needed to attend. His shoulders ached from buffing floors, and his eyes felt heavy with exhaustion. Standing room only, folks, called out Barbara from HR, directing latecomers to the edges of the room. Please make sure everyone can see the podium. Through the crowd, Jack spotted Sophie slipping in through the side door. She wore a navy pantsuit today, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small wave before taking a seat in the back row. Something about her expression seemed tense, different from her usual cheerful demeanor. Richard Renshaw strode to the podium with measured steps, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent. His charcoal suit looked crisp and expensive, his silver hair perfectly styled. He adjusted the microphone with practiced precision. Good morning. Renshaw's voice filled the room, deep and authoritative. I appreciate you all being here today. As you know, Renshaw Manufacturing has always prided itself on staying competitive in an ever-changing market. Jack noticed several executives nodding from their front row seats. He'd cleaned their offices enough times to recognize their faces, though they'd never noticed him. However, Renshaw continued, recent market analysis has shown we need to implement some strategic changes to maintain our edge. He paused, scanning the room. In the coming weeks, we will be undertaking a comprehensive cost restructuring initiative. The whispers started immediately. Jack saw people exchanging worried glances across their tables. A young woman in accounting clutched her paper cup so tightly it crumpled. This restructuring, Renshaw's voice cut through the murmurs, will involve streamlining our operations across all departments. Several positions have been identified as redundant or unnecessarily costly to maintain in-house. Jack's stomach tightened. He'd heard similar speeches before, at the factory where he'd worked for 15 years before being laid off. The same corporate language, the same careful way of avoiding the word firing. The following departments will see immediate changes. Renshaw lifted a paper from the podium. Maintenance and janitorial services will be outsourced to an external contractor. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Jack's feet. Blood rushed in his ears, nearly drowning out Renshaw's continued list of cuts. Emily's face flashed in his mind. Her morning asthma treatments, the stack of medical bills on his kitchen counter, the college fund he'd barely managed to start. Those affected will receive formal notice within the week, Renshaw's voice continued, steady and detached. Severance packages will be discussed individually with HR. We understand these changes may cause some disruption, but they are necessary for the continued success of our organization. Jack forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the panic rising in his chest. He'd been so careful with his money, taking extra shifts when he could, never missing a day of work. But with Emily's medication costs increasing, from his position against the wall, he could see Sophie's face had drained of color. She sat rigid in her chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. When had she learned about this? Had she known all along? Implementation will begin immediately. Renshaw straightened his tie. Your supervisors will provide more detailed information throughout the day. Remember, change, while challenging, often leads to greater opportunities. The room remained eerily quiet. Jack saw Tom from the night shift maintenance crew slump in his chair, his weather-worn face ashen. Tom had 3 kids in college. That concludes our meeting. Renshaw gathered his papers. Please return to your regular duties. Department heads, there will be a follow-up meeting in the conference room in 15 minutes. The spell broke. Chairs scraped back as people stood, their voices rising in a mixture of relief and distress. Jack watched Sophie push back from her table abruptly, her movements uncharacteristically sharp. She glanced in his direction, her eyes wide with what looked like guilt or shock. He couldn't tell which. Before he could catch her eye properly, she turned and slipped out the back door of the cafeteria, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Jack remained against the wall, letting the crowd thin out around him. The morning sunlight streaming through the cafeteria windows suddenly seemed too bright, almost harsh. He thought of the soup he'd left in the staff fridge for Emily's lunch, wondering if he'd even be allowed to finish his shift today. A group of executives brushed past him, already discussing transition plans as if they were talking about replacing office furniture. Jack watched Renshaw shake hands with several board members, his expression unchanging, like a man who just announced a minor policy update rather than upended dozens of lives. The cafeteria slowly emptied, leaving behind abandoned coffee cups and the lingering scent of anxiety. Jack's mop and bucket stood forgotten in the corner where he'd left them when the meeting was called. He stared at them, these simple tools that had helped him rebuild a life after the factory closed, that had allowed him to keep providing for Emily. Now they stood as silent witnesses to another ending he hadn't seen coming. The winter sun had already set by 6 o'clock, leaving the company parking lot in a blue twilight. Security lights cast harsh circles on the snow-dusted asphalt, where a solitary figure worked at scraping thick ice from a weathered Honda Civic's windshield. Jack's breath came out in white puffs as he chipped away at the stubborn layer. His fingers, red and stiff despite his worn work gloves, gripped the plastic scraper tightly. The news from the morning's meeting weighed heavy on his mind, making each scratch of the ice scraper sound like a countdown timer. Need some help with that? He turned to find Sophie standing a few feet away, clutching her purse close against the cold. Her cheeks were pink from the bitter wind, and she'd traded her usual flats for sensible snow boots. Thanks, but I'm almost done here. Jack returned to his task, though his shoulders remained tense. Shouldn't you be headed home? It's getting dark. Sophie took a step closer, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. I wanted to catch you before you left. She hugged herself against the chill. About the meeting this morning. Jack's scraping slowed but didn't stop. Not much to say about it, is there? Business is business. His voice was carefully neutral, but his knuckles whitened around the scraper's handle. It's not right. Sophie burst out, her words forming little clouds in the frigid air. They can't just… She stopped herself, taking a deep breath. I mean, there has to be something we can do. Jack finally paused, turning to face her. In the harsh parking lot lights, she looked younger than usual, almost vulnerable. Listen, Sophie, I appreciate the thought, but… He sighed, his breath visible in the cold. Sometimes things just work out this way. No. Sophie's voice was firm now. I'm going to help however I can. I promise. Her eyes held a determination that caught Jack off guard. Why? The question came out before he could stop it. Why do you care what happens to the night janitor? Sophie stepped closer, her boots leaving neat prints in the thin layer of snow. Because you were kind to me when no one else was. Because you make this place better just by being here. She wrapped her arms tighter around herself. Because it matters. Jack felt something catch in his throat. He thought of Emily at home, probably already working on her homework at the kitchen table. Of the pills she needed every month that insurance only partially covered. Of the college fund that existed only in his dreams. I don't know what you think you can do, he said finally, his voice rough. Let me try. Sophie's words hung in the cold air between them. Please. A few snowflakes began to drift down, catching in Sophie's hair and on her dark wool coat. Jack looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, he said simply, though the words felt inadequate. Sophie gave him a small, determined smile. You should get home before the snow gets worse. She gestured at the sky, where heavy clouds promised more to come. Jack finished clearing the last patch of ice from his windshield and tossed the scraper onto the passenger seat. As he opened the driver's side door, Sophie called out one more time. Jack? He paused, one foot already in the car. Everything's going to be okay. Her voice carried clearly across the empty parking lot. Jack nodded again, not trusting himself to speak. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, which protested the cold with a wheezing cough before turning over. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the snowflakes began falling faster, dancing in his headlight beams. Jack's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles white against the cracked vinyl. In his rearview mirror, Sophie's figure grew smaller until she disappeared in the swirling snow, like she'd never been there at all. The drive home seemed longer than usual, each traffic light a pause for his thoughts to crowd in. Sophie's promise echoed in his mind, mixing with the morning's announcement and the endless calculations of how to make ends meet. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against the falling snow, marking time like a metronome counting down uncertain days ahead. The Monday morning air felt crisp and sharp in Sophie's lungs as she lingered near the maintenance office, pretending to check her phone. Her leather notebook was tucked under her arm, its pages already filled with careful observations from the past week. Through the frosted glass window, she could see Jack's familiar shape moving around inside. Sophie had arrived early, knowing Jack always started his day by organizing supplies and checking the maintenance schedule. She learned his routines, how he moved through the building like clockwork, quiet and efficient. But it was the moments between tasks that really caught her attention. The maintenance office door opened, and Jack emerged wearing his Navy work uniform, a ring of keys jingling at his hip. Sophie ducked behind a corner, watching as he stopped to help Mrs. Martinez from accounting pick up scattered papers she'd dropped. It wasn't part of his job, but he did it anyway, even taking time to sort them by date before handing them back. Sophie's pen moved across her notebook. 7:45 a.m. Assists employees without being asked. Shows attention to detail. Throughout the morning, Sophie trailed Jack at a distance, making careful notes. She saw him replace light bulbs in the accounting department before anyone reported them flickering. He adjusted the thermostat in different zones of the building, knowing exactly which areas needed more heat on cold mornings. When the coffee maker in the break room started making strange noises, he had it fixed before the morning rush hit. 9:30 a.m. Anticipates problems before they occur. Preventive maintenance saves company money on repairs. Around 10, Sophie noticed a new face in the hallway, a young man in a custodial uniform, standing uncertainly near the supply closet. He had a slight tremor in his hands and seemed confused by the equipment around him. Jack appeared moments later, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Hey there," Jack said, extending his hand. "You must be Tommy. I'm Jack. They told me you'd be starting today." Tommy's handshake was hesitant. "Yes, sir. I'm not sure where to start." "First off, no sir needed. Just Jack," he said with a gentle chuckle. "And starting is the easy part. Let me show you around." Sophie followed at a distance as Jack gave Tommy a tour of the supply closet. He took his time explaining each cleaning product, demonstrating proper mixing ratios, and showing which tools worked best for different tasks. When Tommy struggled to remember something, Jack never showed frustration. He just found a different way to explain it. 11:15 a.m. Patient Mentor creates positive training environment for new employees. The most impressive moment came when Jack introduced Tommy to the floor buffer. The large machine looked intimidating, and Tommy's hands shook more visibly as he approached it. "This thing scared me too when I first started," Jack admitted, patting the buffer's handle. "Tell you what, let's break it down into simple steps." For the next hour, Jack demonstrated the buffer's controls, explaining everything in clear, simple terms. He let Tommy practice in a quiet hallway, standing close by for support but never hovering or making Tommy feel watched. When Tommy struggled with the machine's weight, Jack showed him a technique that used leverage instead of strength. "You're doing great," Jack encouraged when Tommy managed to buff a small section. "See how it gets easier once you find your rhythm." Sophie's pen flew across the page. 12:30 p.m. Excellent training skills. Adapts teaching methods to accommodate employee needs. Creates inclusive work environment. During lunch break, Sophie noticed Jack checking his watch repeatedly. His shift had technically ended at noon, but he was still working with Tommy, ensuring the new employee felt comfortable with each task. "Don't worry about the time," Jack told Tommy when he apologized for taking so long to learn. "Everyone starts somewhere. What matters is getting it right." They worked through the early afternoon, Jack demonstrating different cleaning patterns with the buffer. Tommy's confidence grew with each successful pass, his tremors lessening as he focused on the task. By 2 o'clock, he was managing straight lines down the hallway with only minimal guidance. "You've got this," Jack said, standing back to admire Tommy's work. "Look at how even that shine is. That's professional quality right there." Tommy's face lit up with pride. "Really?" "Absolutely. You're ready to tackle this on your own tomorrow." Jack helped Tommy wind up the buffer's cord. "But you can always find me if you need a refresher. I'm usually around somewhere, fixing something." Sophie watched as Tommy gathered his things to leave, noting how his posture had changed. The nervous young man from the morning now stood straighter, more confident. Before leaving, he turned back to Jack. "Thank you," Tommy said, "for taking so much time to help me." Jack just shrugged, that familiar, modest gesture Sophie had come to recognize. "That's what teammates do. See you tomorrow, Tommy." As Tommy left, Sophie glanced down at her notebook, now filled with detailed observations. She'd seen more than just job training today. She'd witnessed genuine kindness, patience, and dedication. Jack had spent hours of his own time ensuring a new employee would succeed, asking nothing in return. Sophie carefully tucked her notebook into her bag, her mind already working on how to use these observations. Each note was another piece of evidence showing Jack's true value to the company, value that went far beyond his official job description. She watched as Jack finally headed back to the maintenance office, probably to catch up on all the work he'd set aside to help Tommy. He walked with that same quiet purpose he always had, unaware that anyone had noticed his actions today. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows across Jack's weathered pickup truck as he pulled into the apartment complex parking lot. His shoulders ached from hours of stocking shelves and manning the register at Pete's Gas Go. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47 p.m., another late night after his regular janitor shift at Renshaw Manufacturing. Jack's feet dragged as he climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment. The metal railing felt ice-cold against his palm, and his breath formed small clouds in the winter air. His mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting on the kitchen counter. Emily's asthma medication alone ate up most of his regular paycheck. The key stuck in the lock like it always did. Jack jiggled it gently, careful not to make too much noise. Mrs. Thompson from next door was watching Emily, and he didn't want to wake either of them if they'd fallen asleep. The apartment door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Thompson knitting in his worn armchair, the TV playing on mute. She looked up and gave him a sympathetic smile. "Emily tried to wait up for you," she whispered, gathering her things. "Poor thing fell asleep about an hour ago." Jack reached for his wallet, but Mrs. Thompson waved him off. "Don't you dare, Jack Rourke. That child is a blessing to watch." He walked her to the door, murmuring his thanks. After she left, Jack stood in the dim living room, taking in the familiar sight of Emily's colored pencils scattered across the coffee table and her favorite blanket draped over the couch. The kitchen light buzzed as he flicked it on. His dinner, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in plastic, sat waiting on the counter with a sticky note in Emily's careful handwriting. "For Daddy ate seal." Jack's throat tightened. He unwrapped the sandwich and ate it standing up, too tired to even sit. The bills seemed to stare at him from their spot by the microwave. He'd have to figure out how to stretch this week's pay even thinner. Moving quietly down the hallway, Jack peeked into Emily's room. She lay curled up under her princess comforter, her brown curls spread across the pillow. Her breathing was steady tonight. No wheezing. Thank goodness for small mercies. Something colorful caught his eye on her nightstand. A piece of paper, covered in crayon drawings. Jack picked it up carefully, moving closer to the hall light to see better. The picture showed two stick figures, one tall with brown hair, one small with curly hair, holding hands in front of what looked like their apartment building. Hearts and stars decorated the sky, and a bright yellow sun smiled down from the corner. Across the top, in Emily's best attempt at fancy lettering, were the words, "Best Dad in the World." Jack's vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, one hand pressed against the wall to steady himself. The exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the constant worry about money, the fear of losing his position at Renshaw, it all hit him at once. But looking at that drawing, with its wobbly letters and loving details, Jack felt his determination solidify into something stronger than steel. He'd work 3 jobs if he had to. He'd figure out a way to make things work. For Emily. He leaned down and kissed her forehead softly. "Love you, sweetheart," he whispered. In his own sparse bedroom, Jack carefully propped the drawing against his alarm clock where he could see it first thing in the morning. His work clothes for tomorrow were already laid out. He'd have to be back at Renshaw in less than 6 hours. The bed creaked as Jack sank onto it, not bothering to change out of his gas station uniform. He barely managed to kick off his shoes before exhaustion pulled him under. Emily's drawing the last thing he saw before his eyes closed. The crayon stars seemed to shimmer in the darkness, a reminder of why he kept pushing forward, why he refused to give up. His daughter believed he was the best dad in the world, and somehow, some way, he'd make sure she never had reason to think otherwise. The morning sun filtered through the frosted windows of Renshaw Manufacturing's 3rd floor, casting long shadows across the empty hallway. Jack knelt by the conference room door, his toolbox open beside him, as he carefully adjusted a loose hinge that had been squeaking all week. The familiar scent of metal and oil filled his nostrils as he worked, finding comfort in the simple task of fixing things. Voices drifted from around the corner, the distinct, polished tones of executives making their way to their morning meeting. Jack kept his head down, focused on the hinge, but their words carried clearly in the quiet hallway. "Did you see her in accounting yesterday?" A woman's voice, probably Linda from HR, spoke in hushed excitement. "Taking notes on everything, even helped file some reports." "The CEO's daughter?" Another voice replied. Jack recognized it as Marcus from marketing. "Yeah, she's been everywhere lately, shadowing different departments, learning the business from the ground up." Jack's hand froze on the screwdriver. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "That's right, Sophie Renshaw." Linda's voice grew clearer as they approached. "Richard's only daughter. Smart girl, actually working her way up instead of just taking a cushy executive position." Jack's chest tightened. Sophie Renshaw. The young woman who had been sharing lunch breaks with him, laughing at his jokes, asking about Emily. Was the CEO's daughter? The same CEO who had just announced job cuts that would likely leave Jack unemployed? The executives rounded the corner, spotting Jack by the door. Their conversation immediately shifted to weather and quarterly reports as they passed. But the damage was done. Jack barely managed a polite nod, his mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Sophie over the past weeks. The soup he'd given her that first night. The stories about Emily. His complaints about late paychecks and rising medical costs. Heat crept up his neck as he remembered how freely he'd spoken to her, not knowing who she really was. Jack gathered his tools with trembling hands, shame and anger mixing in his chest. Had she been studying him too? Taking notes on the struggling single father, perhaps? Was her kindness just another part of her corporate training, learning how to manage the lower-level employees? The morning wore on, and Jack threw himself into his work with fierce determination. When he heard Sophie's familiar footsteps approaching the maintenance corridor around lunchtime, he quickly ducked into the supply closet, pretending to inventory cleaning supplies. "Jack," her voice called out, warm and friendly as always. "I brought coffee, and those chocolate cookies you mentioned Emily likes." He waited until her footsteps faded before emerging. His jaw clenched tight. 3 times more that day, he changed his route to avoid her, taking the service stairs instead of the elevator, timing his cleaning schedule around her usual breaks. Late afternoon found him waxing the lobby floor, the rhythmic movement of the buffer helping to calm his churning thoughts. The glass doors reflected his image, a middle-aged man in gray maintenance coveralls, doing his job like he always had. No pretense, no hidden agenda. "Jack?" Sophie's voice startled him. She stood near the reception desk, holding 2 paper cups from the cafe across the street. Her smile faltered when he didn't look up. "I missed you at lunch. Is everything okay?" "Fine, Miss Renshaw," he replied flatly, keeping his eyes on the floor. "Just busy today." The silence that followed felt heavy and thick. From the corner of his eye, he saw her flinch at his use of her last name. "I got your favorite hazelnut with extra cream." She tried again, taking a step closer. "Thanks, but I need to finish this section before it dries." His voice came out harder than he intended. "Wouldn't want to disappoint the management." Sophie stood there for a moment longer, and Jack could feel her eyes on him. When he finally glanced up, the hurt in her expression was unmistakable. She set one of the coffee cups on the reception desk, then turned and walked away, her shoulders slightly hunched. Jack watched her reflection in the polished floor as she disappeared around the corner. The coffee cup sat untouched on the desk, steam rising in delicate wisps, a silent reminder of a friendship that had felt real until an hour ago. He gripped the buffer's handle tighter and pushed forward, trying to drown out his thoughts in the machine's steady hum. The gleaming floor beneath him showed a perfect reflection, everything neat, orderly, and exactly as it should be. Just like it had been before he'd let himself hope for something more. Jack stared at the bright yellow poster taped to the staff bulletin board, his coffee growing cold in his hand. "Holiday Volunteer Night at Hope Haven Shelter," it proclaimed in cheerful red letters. "Join us in spreading warmth this season." The date was set for this coming Saturday evening. He started to turn away when a familiar voice called out behind him. "Jack, wait up!" His shoulders tensed. It had been 3 days since he'd overheard the truth about Sophie in the hallway, and he'd managed to avoid any real conversation with her since then. But now here she was, hurrying toward him with that same warm smile that had fooled him for weeks. "I was hoping to catch you," Sophie said, slightly out of breath. She gestured to the poster. "Have you seen this? The shelter could really use some help." Jack took a careful sip of his coffee, keeping his voice neutral. "I saw it." "You should come," Sophie said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm.
"Emily would love it. There's going to be hot chocolate, and they're setting up craft tables for the kids."
At the mention of Emily's name, Jack felt his carefully constructed wall wobble. His daughter had been asking to do more helping things lately, inspired by the stories in her school books about community service. "I don't know," he said, shifting his weight. "It's been pretty cold, and with Emily's asthma." "The shelter's really well heated," Sophie quickly assured him. "And they just got a new air filtration system installed last month. I helped coordinate the donation." She paused, then added more softly. "Emily would get to meet other kids, make some Christmas decorations, It would mean a lot to the families there. Jack studied her face, looking for signs of the privileged CEO's daughter he now knew her to be. But all he saw was the same genuine warmth that had first prompted him to share his soup that night in the break room.
Please, Sophie pressed gently. For Emily's sake? She seems like such a caring girl from everything you've told me.
The mention of his previous conversations with Sophie made Jack wince internally. How many of their talks had been real? How much had been research for her father? But Emily's face floated in his mind. The way she'd light up at the chance to help others. How she'd been saving her allowance to buy cat food for the strays behind their apartment building. She'd been cooped up so much lately with the cold weather. What time? He found himself asking, against his better judgment. Sophie's whole face brightened. It starts at 6. I could meet you both there if you'd like. Jack nodded stiffly. We'll think about it. That evening, as Jack stirred a pot of mac and cheese on the stove, Emily sat at their small kitchen table, swinging her legs while she colored. Hey, kiddo, he said, testing the waters. How would you feel about helping out at the shelter this weekend? They're having a special night where people can come make decorations and serve dinner to folks who need it. Emily's crayon stopped mid-stroke. Really? Like in my book about the girl who helps at the soup kitchen? Something like that, Jack smiled, his heart warming at her enthusiasm. But only if you're feeling up to it. It's pretty cold out.
I'll wear my super warm sweater,
Emily declared, already bouncing in her chair.
And my special mittens from Mrs. Rodriguez? Can we go, Daddy, please?
Looking at her shining face, Jack couldn't help but marvel at how much she reminded him of her mother. The same instinct to help others. The same bright spirit that refused to be dimmed by circumstances. Okay, he agreed, reaching over to ruffle her hair. But you have to promise to tell me right away if you start feeling tired or if your chest gets tight. I promise. Emily threw her arms around his waist.
Can I make cards for people? I have some extra paper from school.
That's a great idea, sweetheart. Saturday evening arrived with a fresh dusting of snow. Jack helped Emily bundle up in layers, thermal undershirt, her favorite purple sweater, winter coat, and the promised mittens from their elderly neighbor. He tucked her inhaler securely in his pocket, just in case. The shelter was only a 15-minute drive from their apartment, but Jack drove slowly, watching the temperature gauge and making sure the heater was keeping Emily warm enough in the back seat. She hummed Christmas carols the whole way, clutching her folder of handmade cards. They pulled into the shelter's small parking lot, already half full with other volunteers' cars. Through the windows, warm light spilled out onto the snow, and Jack could see people moving about inside, carrying boxes and setting up tables.
Look, Daddy,
Emily pointed excitedly.
There's Sophie.
Sure enough, Sophie stood near the entrance, helping unload supplies from someone's trunk. She was dressed casually in jeans and a warm sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, nothing like the corporate attire she wore at work. When she spotted them parking, she waved, her breath visible in the cold air. Jack helped Emily out of the car, making sure her scarf was secured properly around her face. The snow crunched satisfyingly under their boots as they made their way to the entrance, where the sounds of cheerful voices and holiday music drifted out into the night.
I'm so glad you both came.
Sophie's greeting was genuine, her smile reaching her eyes as she bent down to Emily's level.
And who might this be?
I'm Emily, his daughter chirped, holding up her folder. I made cards for everyone. You did? That's so thoughtful. Sophie's expression softened as she looked at the carefully decorated papers. I bet people are going to love these. Jack watched their interaction, feeling his resolve to stay distant waver slightly. CEO's daughter or not, the gentleness in Sophie's voice as she talked to Emily seemed real enough. Should we head inside? Sophie straightened up, gesturing to the door. They're about to start setting up the craft tables, and I heard there might be some cookie decorating too. Emily's eyes widened with delight. Cookies? Can we, Daddy? Let's get you warmed up first, Jack said, guiding her toward the entrance. He could feel Sophie's presence behind them, but he kept his focus on Emily, who was practically vibrating with excitement. The shelter's double doors opened, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Inside, volunteers bustled about, transforming the usual sparse space into something festive with paper chains and tinsel. Tables lined the walls, some already set with craft supplies, others waiting to be filled with food. The air's nice and clean in here, Sophie mentioned quietly to Jack, clearly remembering his earlier concerns about Emily's asthma. And there's a quiet room down the hall if she needs a break. Jack nodded, surprised and somewhat touched by her thoughtfulness. As they stepped fully into the warmth of the shelter, Emily's small hand found his, squeezing it excitedly. The snow continued to crunch under the boots of arriving volunteers outside, but inside, hope and warmth filled every corner of the bustling shelter. The Hope Haven shelter buzzed with warmth and activity, a welcome contrast to the biting December wind outside. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the long tables where volunteers served steaming trays of food. The air smelled of cinnamon and coffee, mingling with the hearty aroma of chicken stew. Emily bounced on her toes next to Sophie at the serving station, her cheeks pink with excitement as she carefully ladled spoonfuls of mashed potatoes onto each plate. She wore a red and white striped apron that Sophie had found for her, rolled up twice at the waist to fit. "You're doing such a great job, Emily," Sophie said, watching the little girl's concentrated expression. "That's perfect portion control." Emily beamed up at her. "Dad says it's important not to waste food, but also important to make sure everybody gets enough." She turned to the next person in line, an elderly woman with a weathered face. "Would you like extra gravy, ma'am?" At the far end of the room, Jack knelt beside an old heating unit that had started making alarming rattling sounds. His toolbox lay open beside him, its contents neatly arranged on a cloth. His breath came out in visible puffs. This corner of the room was significantly colder than the rest. "How's it looking?" asked Marcus, the shelter coordinator, wringing his hands. "We've got another cold front coming tonight." Jack pulled out his flashlight, shining it into the unit's interior. "Looks like the blower motor's working loose. See these mounting brackets? They're worn pretty bad." He reached deeper into the heater, his movements careful and practiced. "I think I can stabilize it enough to get you through the next few days, but you'll want to get a proper replacement soon." The shelter's front door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and a tall figure that made Sophie nearly drop her serving spoon. Her father, Richard Renshaw, stood in the entrance, brushing snow from his expensive wool coat. He looked decidedly out of place among the casual volunteers and shelter residents. Sophie hadn't actually expected him to come. She'd mentioned the volunteer night during their weekly dinner, but he'd only given his usual non-committal, "We'll see." Now here he was, his presence commanding attention even in this humble setting. Emily didn't notice the new arrival, too absorbed in her careful portioning. "Sophie, we're almost out of potatoes. Should I get more from the kitchen?" "I'll get them," Sophie said quickly, not wanting to leave Emily alone at the serving station. "You keep up the excellent work." As Sophie hurried to the kitchen, she saw her father moving slowly around the room's perimeter, nodding at employees who recognized him. His expression remained neutral, but she knew that, look, he was observing, evaluating. When she returned with the fresh tray of potatoes, Richard had made his way to the corner where Jack worked. Sophie's heart beat faster as she watched her father stand silently, hands clasped behind his back, studying Jack's methodical movements. Jack either hadn't noticed his audience or was choosing to focus entirely on his task. He had partially disassembled the heater now, his hands steady as he tightened connections and replaced a frayed wire. "Could you pass me that Phillips head?" Jack asked without looking up, clearly assuming Marcus was still nearby. Instead, Richard bent down, selected the correct screwdriver from the tool layout, and handed it over. Jack glanced up, surprise flickering across his face as he recognized the CEO. But his voice remained steady. "Thank you, sir." Richard didn't move away. "You seem to know your way around these old units." "Yes, sir. Had one similar to this in my first apartment." Jack carefully reattached the access panel. "They're simple machines, really. Just need a little attention now and then." The heater hummed to life, this time without the alarming rattle. Warm air began flowing steadily from the vents. Marcus hurried over, relief evident on his face. "That's incredible. We've been struggling with that heater for weeks." He turned to Richard. "Your employee here is a lifesaver." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed." His gaze shifted to where Emily was still serving food, chatting cheerfully with each person who came through the line. "And that's your daughter?" "Yes, sir, Emily." Pride softened Jack's features as he watched her. She seems quite capable for her age. She is. Jack began packing up his tools with practiced efficiency. If you'll excuse me, sir, I should check on her. Richard nodded, extending his hand. Good work tonight, Rourke. Jack shook the offered hand firmly, meeting his boss's eyes. Richard's expression remained unreadable as he turned and walked toward the exit, pulling his coat closer against the coming cold. Sophie watched her father leave, then hurried over to where Jack stood, still holding his toolbox. I didn't know he was coming, she said quickly. I mean, I mentioned it, but… It's fine, Jack said, his voice quiet. I'm here because Emily wanted to help. That's all that matters. Across the room, Emily's clear voice rang out. Would you like extra gravy, sir? Dad says everybody deserves something warm on a cold night. The morning after the shelter event, Sophie practically floated through the hallways of Renshaw Manufacturing. Her wool sweater caught the early sunlight streaming through the windows, making her look almost luminous as she searched for Jack. She found him in his usual spot, carefully mopping the east wing corridor. Jack! Her voice rang with barely contained excitement. Did you see how impressed my father was last night? The way he watched you fix that heater was amazing. Jack paused his mopping, a cautious smile crossing his weathered face. Your father seemed like a decent man. He kept his tone measured, not wanting to show how much he'd been thinking about that brief handshake. Sophie leaned against the wall, her eyes bright. He rarely stays at these events more than 5 minutes, but he was there for almost an hour. And did you notice how he asked all those questions about the shelter's maintenance needs? Jack resumed his slow, methodical mopping. Just doing what needed doing, that's all. But inside, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe her father had seen something worthwhile in him. Emily was wonderful too, Sophie continued, following alongside him as he worked. Everyone loved her. Mrs. Martinez from accounting couldn't stop talking about how sweet she was with the elderly guests. A genuine smile spread across Jack's face at the mention of his daughter. She's got a big heart, that one. Just like her mother. He paused, then added softly, Thank you for suggesting we come. It meant a lot to her. Sophie beamed. Speaking of Emily, I have something for her. She dug into her messenger bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. It's just some colored pencils I noticed her admiring in the art supply store window last week. I thought maybe she could use them for her drawings. Jack's throat tightened. It was exactly the kind of thing he wished he could afford to buy Emily himself. Sophie, you don't have to. I want to, she insisted, pressing the package into his hands. Besides, anyone who makes soup as good as yours deserves a little kindness in return. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. He tucked the package into his pocket, already imagining Emily's delighted expression when she opened it. Throughout the morning, Jack found himself humming as he worked, something he hadn't done since before the announcement of the job cuts. He even caught himself making plans, thinking maybe he could start saving for Emily's summer camp if things worked out. The shelter's director had mentioned they might need some part-time maintenance help, and with his regular job secure. Around noon, the mail cart made its rounds. Jack was cleaning the windows near the break room when Jerry, the mail clerk, called out to him. Got something for you, Jack. From HR. Jack set down his cleaning supplies and wiped his hands on his uniform. The envelope was crisp and white, with the company logo embossed in the corner. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, the paper making a sharp tearing sound in the quiet hallway. The hope that had been building all morning shattered as his eyes moved across the typed words. Dear Mr. Rourke, this letter serves as formal notification that your employment with Renshaw Manufacturing will be terminated effective immediately. The paper quivered in his hands. The colored pencils in his pocket suddenly felt like lead weights. Down the hall, he could hear Sophie's voice approaching, still bright with optimism, still unaware that her father's handshake had meant nothing at all. The kitchen light flickered dimly above Jack's head as he stared at the crisp white paper in his trembling hands. The termination letter's official letterhead seemed to mock him, its neat typeface spelling out the end of his stability in cold, impersonal terms. At the small kitchen table beside him, Emily hummed softly, her crayon scratching against paper as she worked on her latest masterpiece. Jack's throat felt tight as he watched his daughter. Her dark hair fell forward as she concentrated, tongue poking out slightly, just like her mother used to do when focusing on something. The morning sun, streaming through their worn curtains, caught the glitter in her rainbow drawing, making it sparkle. "Almost done, Daddy," Emily announced proudly, not looking up from her work. "It's going to be your new office decoration." The paper crinkled in Jack's grip. He quickly folded it and slipped it into his pocket before Emily could notice. "That's wonderful, sweetie," he managed, his voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging inside him. Emily finally looked up, her bright eyes searching his face. "Are you okay? You look kind of sick." Jack forced a smile, reaching across to smooth her hair. "I'm fine, Em. Actually." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I might be having some changes at work soon. Might mean I'll be home more." "Really?" Emily's face lit up. "Like for movie nights and stuff?" "Maybe," Jack said softly, his heart breaking at her enthusiasm. "We'll see." Across town at Renshaw Manufacturing, Sophie burst through the heavy oak doors of her father's corner office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Richard Renshaw barely glanced up from his computer screen, his fingers continuing to type as his daughter approached his desk. "How could you?" Sophie's voice shook with anger. She slammed a copy of Jack's termination letter onto his desk, sending several papers fluttering to the floor. "After everything you saw last night?" Richard finally stopped typing, leaning back in his leather chair with a weary sigh. "Sophie, we've discussed this. Business decisions aren't made based on one evening of charity work." "Charity work?" Sophie's cheeks flushed red. He saved that shelter thousands of dollars by fixing their heating system. He stayed 2 hours after everyone else left to make sure it was working properly. "And that's just one example." "Lower your voice," Richard warned, glancing toward his open office door. "This isn't a discussion for the entire floor to hear." Sophie stepped closer, lowering her voice but maintaining its intensity. "I've been watching him for weeks. Do you know he trained Tommy, the new hire with Down syndrome, on his own time? He comes in early every single day to make sure the floors are dry before anyone arrives. He fixed the break room microwave that maintenance said needed replacing." "Sophie, he's raising a daughter alone," she continued, her voice cracking. "A little girl with asthma who needs medication. Did you even look at his personnel file before making this decision?" Richard stood up, straightening his tie. "I looked at the numbers. The outsourcing company can provide the same services at 60% of our current costs. This isn't personal." "It's very personal to Jack and Emily." Sophie wiped angrily at a tear trailing down her cheek. "You talk about company loyalty in every speech you give, but when someone actually shows it, goes above and beyond every single day, you throw them away like they're nothing." "That's enough," Richard's tone hardened. "The decision is made. The paperwork is filed. This discussion is over." Sophie stared at her father, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Her shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of her. "You know what Mom would say about this?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't." "She would be ashamed." Sophie's voice was barely a whisper now. Tears streamed freely down her face as she turned and walked toward the door. She paused in the doorway, not turning back. "And so am I." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of Richard's office. He remained standing, staring at the space where his daughter had been, the morning sun casting long shadows across his desk. Back in Jack's kitchen, Emily held up her completed drawing. "See? It's you and me and a rainbow, because you always say there's a rainbow after every storm." Jack swallowed hard, pulling his daughter into a tight hug. "It's perfect, sweetheart," he whispered into her hair, holding her close while she couldn't see the tears in his eyes. "Absolutely perfect." The termination letter felt heavy in his pocket, but Emily's small arms around his neck felt heavier. He had no idea how he would tell her, how he would make this okay. But for now, he just held her, memorizing the feel of this moment when his daughter still believed her daddy could fix anything. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the winter wind. The weather forecast had predicted a storm, but Jack hadn't expected it to hit quite so soon. He hadn't expected any of this to hit so soon. Emily wiggled out of his embrace and returned to her coloring, completely unaware of how their world had just shifted. Jack watched her, his mind racing through calculations, their savings, bills due next week, Emily's medication that needed refilling. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how he tried to make them work. Sophie's heels clicked rapidly down the corporate hallway, her vision blurred by tears. Employees quickly stepped out of her way, pretending not to notice the CEO's daughter crying. She made it to the ladies' room just as a sob escaped her throat, locking herself in a stall as her carefully maintained composure finally crumbled. She had really believed her father would change his mind after seeing Jack at the shelter. She had been so certain that showing him Jack's worth would make a difference. Her naivety now felt crushing. In his office, Richard Renshaw stood at his window, looking out over the parking lot where his employees' cars were covered in fresh snow. He picked up the framed photo on his desk, Sophie's mother on their wedding day, her smile radiant and kind. For a moment, his finger traced the edge of the frame, but then he set it face down and returned to his computer. "Business needs," he muttered to himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Jack's fingers traced the edge of his metal locker in the maintenance room, lingering over the small dent where he'd once bumped it with a ladder. The familiar scent of pine cleaner and metal polish filled the air as he began emptying his belongings into a cardboard box. Each item held a memory. The thermos Emily had decorated with stickers last Christmas. The worn work gloves his wife had given him years ago. The small toolkit he'd used to fix countless broken things around the building. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he methodically cleared the shelves. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man trying to delay the inevitable. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, his usual shift time. But tonight would be his last in these halls. He pulled out his neatly folded spare uniform, remembering how proud he'd felt when he first put it on. It hadn't been glamorous work, but it had been honest and steady. The fabric felt heavy in his hands as he placed it in the box. The sound of rushing footsteps echoed down the corridor. Jack didn't need to look up to know who it was. Sophie appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, her eyes wide with distress. "Jack, please," she said, stepping into the small room. "Don't do this. We can fight this decision. My father—" "Miss Renshaw," Jack cut her off quietly, continuing to pack. The formal address made her flinch. "I appreciate everything you've tried to do. Really, I do. But you can't just give up." Sophie's voice cracked. "What about Emily? What about—" "Emily is exactly why I can't waste time fighting battles I won't win." Jack's hands stilled on the half-filled box. "Your father made his decision. Business is business." Sophie moved closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "That's not fair, and you know it. You're the hardest worker here, the most dependable person in this whole building." A sad smile crossed Jack's face as he carefully wrapped his coffee mug in yesterday's newspaper. "Life's taught me not to expect miracles, Miss Renshaw. Sometimes things just are what they are." "Stop calling me that," Sophie whispered. "I'm still the same person who shared lunch with you, who helped you organize supply closets. Being the CEO's daughter doesn't change who I am." Jack finally looked up at her, his eyes tired but kind. "No, it doesn't. You're a good person, Sophie. But it changes what you can promise, what you can fix." He reached for the small framed photo of Emily he'd kept on the shelf, carefully wrapping it in his worn jacket before placing it in the box. Sophie watched him, her hands clenched at her sides. "I could talk to him again," she insisted. "Make him understand." "That his daughter made friends with the janitor?" Jack shook his head. "That won't help anyone, least of all you." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. "Is that all you think this was? Some kind of charity project?" "No," Jack said softly. "But sometimes friendship isn't enough to change the way the world works." He picked up his tool belt, the one he'd used just last week to fix the break room microwave, the conference room projector, countless door hinges. It joined the growing pile in his box. Sophie stepped forward, reaching for his arm. "Let me help you carry." "Please don't," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've done enough, more than enough." The last item in his locker was a child's drawing, taped carefully to the inside of the door. Emily's artwork showed 3 stick figures, her, Jack, and her mother, as an angel in the sky. He peeled it off slowly, making sure not to tear the edges. Sophie watched him fold it carefully and tuck it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The gesture made her throat tight with emotion. "What will you tell Emily?" she asked softly. Jack picked up the box, adjusting its weight in his arms. "That sometimes life throws us curves, but we keep swinging anyway. That her dad loves her and will figure something out." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Thank you, Sophie. For the coffees, the conversations, for caring. Not many people would have bothered." "Jack, wait!" Sophie's voice trembled. But he was already walking down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The automatic lights flickered on as he passed, creating a path of illumination that led to the exit. The night air hit him like a physical force as he pushed through the heavy door. Snow was falling again, fat flakes catching in his hair and on his shoulders. His breath formed clouds in the cold as he walked across the parking lot, the box of 5 years' worth of memories growing heavier with each step. At his car, Jack paused one last time, looking back at the building where he'd spent so many nights. Through the windows, he could see Sophie standing in the lobby, watching him. He gave her a small nod, not quite a goodbye, not quite forgiveness, before opening his car door. The box settled onto the passenger seat with a quiet thud, Emily's drawing crinkling softly against his chest as he bent to get in. The engine turned over with its familiar rattle, and Jack pulled out of his parking space for the last time. Sophie's figure grew smaller in his rearview mirror as snowflakes swirled in his headlights, erasing his tracks almost as quickly as he made them. The bell above Joe's pawnshop chimed as Jack pushed open the heavy glass door. A gust of icy wind followed him inside, rustling the yellowed price tags that dangled from shelves crammed with other people's memories. His old Gibson guitar felt heavier than usual in its worn case, and the toolbox he'd carried from his car made his arms ache. Joe, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair, looked up from behind the counter. Recognition flickered across his face. "Jack Rourke. Been a while." "Yeah." Jack's voice was rough as he set the guitar case on the counter. The leather was cracked, but still smooth in places where his hands had gripped it countless nights, playing lullabies for Emily. "Need to sell these today." Joe's eyes softened. He'd known Jack since before Sarah passed away, had watched him come in to buy Emily's birthday presents during the lean years. "You sure about this? That Gibson's practically vintage." Jack unlatched the case, revealing the honey-colored wood beneath. His fingers brushed the strings one last time. "Emily's medicine went up again. Insurance won't cover the difference." The pawnbroker nodded slowly, examining the guitar with practiced hands. "She doing okay? That little girl of yours?" "Getting better. Doctor says the new inhaler helps." Jack managed a tight smile, though his chest felt hollow. "Just need to keep up with the payments." Next came the toolbox, socket sets, screwdrivers, and wrenches, each one carefully maintained despite years of use. These were the tools that had helped him fix everything from leaky faucets to broken furnaces, earning extra cash when the regular paycheck wasn't enough. Joe whistled low as he assessed the tools. "Premium stuff here, Jack. Well kept, too." He punched numbers into a calculator, his expression thoughtful. "I can give you $800 for the lot. That's top dollar considering." It was more than Jack had expected, but still not enough for long-term peace of mind. "I appreciate that, Joe." As the pawnbroker counted out the bills, Jack noticed a help wanted sign in the window of Mike's Hardware across the street. His mind was already calculating hours and possibilities. Outside, the winter wind bit through his jacket as he walked to his car. The money felt heavy in his pocket. Emily's medication secured for another month, at least. He pulled out his phone and opened the job search app he downloaded yesterday. 3 new listings had popped up. A diner needed evening cleaning, a small office building wanted weekend maintenance, and several homes needed snow shoveling. By sunset, Jack had filled out applications at 6 different places and arranged to shovel driveways in the morning. His back protested as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, but he straightened up before opening the door. Emily sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by homework papers. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Dad, look what I got on my science test." She held up a paper marked with a bright red A. "That's my girl!" Jack's smile was genuine this time as he hugged her. How about celebratory mac and cheese for dinner? While Emily chatted about her day, Jack moved around the kitchen, measuring pasta and cheese powder from the discount box. He kept his movements casual when a coughing fit interrupted her story, pretending not to notice how she reached for her inhaler. "You know what?" Emily said between bites of dinner. "Mrs. Peterson next door said she might need help organizing her garage. I told her you're really good at fixing things." Jack's throat tightened. "That was thoughtful of you, sweetheart." He'd have to find time between the other jobs, but every little bit helped. The next morning came too early and too cold. Jack dropped Emily at school before heading to his first shoveling job. The snow had fallen thick overnight, turning the world white and silent. His breath fogged in the air as he worked, methodically clearing one driveway after another. By mid-morning, he was outside Sweet Dreams Bakery, pushing snow away from their entrance. The work was mechanical: lift, throw, repeat, giving his mind time to wander. He thought about the guitar, about Sarah, about the way Emily's face lit up when she showed him her test score. The ache in his muscles was nothing compared to the determination in his heart. The bakery's door chimed, and the smell of fresh bread wafted out. "Would you like some coffee?" the owner called. "On the house. You're doing such a nice job." "Thank you, ma'am." Jack paused to accept the steaming cup, his gloved hands grateful for the warmth. As he turned back to his work, he caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. Sophie stood there, her red coat bright against the snow, her face a mixture of concern and something else, something that looked like resolve. Jack quickly looked away, focusing on the task at hand. The sound of his shovel scraping concrete filled the air, drowning out thoughts of what had been lost. What mattered now was moving forward, one step at a time, one job at a time, keeping Emily safe and warm and breathing easy. More driveways waited, more odd jobs would come, and somehow they would make it through this winter, just like they'd made it through every other challenge life had thrown their way. Jack adjusted his grip on the shovel and kept working, the morning sun casting long shadows across the newly fallen snow. Sophie sat at her desk in her small apartment, the laptop's glow casting shadows across stacks of crumpled papers. The wall clock ticked past midnight, but she barely noticed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, then paused. Delete. Type again. The words had to be perfect. "To the board of directors and my father, Richard Renshaw," she read aloud, testing how the words felt in her mouth. The formal greeting felt cold, distant, exactly what she needed. Her father had taught her that business was about precision. Well, she would be precise. Empty coffee cups littered her desk, testament to hours spent crafting each sentence. Her normally tidy apartment showed signs of neglect: dishes in the sink, coat thrown over a chair, mail unopened. None of that mattered now. What mattered was getting this right. She thought of Jack's face when he'd walked out of the building that last time, box of belongings in his arms. The image made her stomach clench. Earlier today, she'd seen him outside Sally's bakery, methodically shoveling snow despite the biting wind. He hadn't noticed her watching from her car, and she was glad. The sight of him doing manual labor in the cold while her father sat in his heated office made her blood boil. "The measure of a company isn't just its profit margins," she continued reading, "but how it treats every single employee, from the CEO to the night janitor." Sophie underlined that sentence. It would make her father squirm, and good. Let him squirm. She stood up, pacing her small living room as she rehearsed. Jack Rourke isn't just a line item on a budget spreadsheet. He's a widowed father who works harder than anyone I've ever met. Her voice grew stronger with each word. While others left at 5 o'clock, he stayed late to teach David, our new hire with Down syndrome, how to use the floor buffer. When the pipe burst in the east wing, Jack prevented thousands in water damage because he knew every inch of this building's infrastructure. The memories flowed faster now. She typed quickly, not wanting to lose a single detail. He fixed the heater at the homeless shelter on Christmas Eve, not because it was his job, but because people were cold and he could help. "That's who you fired, Father." "That's the man you decided wasn't worth keeping." Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she wrote the next part. This would hurt her father the most, but it needed to be said. Mom always told me that character reveals itself in how we treat those who can't do anything for us in return. Jack showed me kindness when he thought I was just a crying intern. He shared his lunch with me, made me laugh, treated me like a person instead of the CEO's daughter. She paused, remembering the warm soup on that first day, how it had tasted of home and comfort when she'd felt so lost. If you want to know why I'm standing here today, risking my position and probably my trust fund, it's because Jack Rourke taught me more about leadership in 3 months than I've learned in 24 years of watching you run this company. The radiator hummed in the corner as Sophie read through her speech again, making small adjustments. Outside, snow fell silently on empty streets. The board meeting was in 2 days. Her father would be furious, might even disown her. The thought made her chest tight, but not as tight as watching Jack sell his belongings to buy his daughter's medicine. She thought of Emily, with her bright smile and careful drawings. The little girl had made her a card last week, covered in glitter and wobbly hearts. "Thank you for being nice to my daddy," it had said in purple crayon. Sophie had cried when she read it. The final paragraph took shape under her fingers. "So yes, Father, you can cut costs. You can trim budgets. You can optimize efficiency. But when you do it by throwing away good people, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting this company's soul. And I won't stand silently by while you do it." Sophie printed the speech, the printer whirring in the quiet apartment. 3 pages. Her hands were steady now as she stapled them together. The words felt right, felt true in a way that made her chest swell with certainty. She glanced at her phone. 2:47 a.m. The board meeting was at 9, just enough time to get some sleep, though she doubted she'd be able to. Her father had always said business decisions shouldn't be emotional. Well, maybe some decisions needed to be emotional. Maybe some things were worth fighting for, even if you knew you might lose. Sophie slipped the speech into her leather purse, smoothing the pages carefully. Whatever happened next, she would know she'd done the right thing. She owed Jack that much. She owed herself that much, too. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Renshaw Manufacturing's top-floor conference room. 10 board members in pressed suits and crisp blouses settled into their leather chairs, arranging papers and coffee cups on the polished mahogany table. At the head of the table, Richard Renshaw adjusted his tie, his face stern as always. Sophie stood at the far end, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of her printed speech. She wore her most professional outfit, a navy blazer and pencil skirt, but her heart thundered beneath the formal exterior. The room felt colder than usual, despite the heating system's quiet hum. "The floor is yours, Miss Renshaw," Richard said, his tone clipped and formal. Several board members exchanged curious glances. The CEO's daughter rarely attended these meetings, let alone presented. Sophie took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "Thank you, Father." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm here today to talk about someone who embodies the very values this company was built on, though you might not know his name." She pulled out a photograph and held it up. It showed Jack fixing the shelter's heater on Christmas Eve, his face focused and kind even as he worked. "This is Jack Rourke. Until recently, he was our night shift janitor." Richard's jaw tightened, but Sophie pressed on. "Over the past few months, I've watched Jack work. Not because I was assigned to, but because his dedication caught my attention. The first time I met him, I was crying in the break room after a particularly rough day. Instead of awkwardly walking away, he shared his homemade soup with me, soup he'd made for his daughter's lunch." She turned to face each board member in turn. "Jack arrives an hour early every shift to make sure the building is perfect for everyone else. When the pipe burst in the East Wing last month, he stayed 4 hours past his shift to help maintenance fix it. He didn't ask for overtime." Sophie's voice grew stronger. "When we hired Tommy, our new custodian with Down syndrome, Jack spent 3 weeks training him after hours. He created simple picture guides to help Tommy learn the equipment. Tommy's mother told me it's the first job her son has kept for more than a month." She pulled out more papers, photographs, maintenance logs, testimony from other employees. Jack fixed the cafeteria's dishwasher when we couldn't get a repair person for days. He changed flat tires for 3 different employees during the last snowstorm. When Maria from accounting had morning sickness, He made sure her trash was emptied more frequently without being asked. The board members leaned forward, some taking notes. Richard's expression remained unchanged, but his fingers drummed once on the table. "But what truly shows Jack's character is how he handles his own struggles," Sophie continued, her voice softening. "He's raising his 8-year-old daughter alone after losing his wife to cancer. Emily has severe asthma, and her medications are expensive. Yet Jack never complained, never asked for help. He just picked up extra jobs to make ends meet." She walked slowly around the table, placing a child's crayon drawing in front of each board member. "These are thank you cards from Emily. She made them for the staff here because, in her words, Daddy always says nice things about the people he works with." Sophie returned to her position at the end of the table, squaring her shoulders. "When I started this internship, Father told me to learn how a successful company operates. Well, I've learned something important, but maybe not what was intended." Her eyes met Richard's directly. "I've learned that a company's true worth isn't just in its profit margins or market share. It's in people like Jack Rourke, who show up every day with dignity and kindness, who make everyone's job a little easier, who teach us that character matters more than position." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "We terminated Jack's position to save money, but what did we lose in return? A mentor to new employees? A problem solver who saved us thousands in repair costs? A man who made this company feel more like a community?" The silence in the room grew heavy. Sophie's voice cracked slightly as she delivered her final words. "If we can't value people like Jack, what do we stand for? Are we truly the company we claim to be in our mission statement? Because from where I stand, we're not just losing a janitor, we're losing our humanity." She gathered her papers with trembling hands, acutely aware of the profound stillness that had fallen over the room, every face turned toward Richard, waiting for his response. The CEO sat motionless, his eyes fixed on his daughter, his expression unreadable. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Sophie stood her ground, heart pounding but chin high, as her father's penetrating gaze seemed to look straight through her. The winter sun had long since set when a knock echoed through Jack's small apartment. Emily looked up from her math homework at the kitchen table, her pencil pausing mid-equation. Jack wiped his hands on a dish towel, frowning at the unexpected interruption. They rarely got visitors, especially this late. "Stay put, sweetie," he said to Emily, who nodded but craned her neck curiously. Jack opened the door and nearly dropped the dish towel. Richard Renshaw, CEO of Renshaw Manufacturing, stood in the dimly lit hallway. His expensive wool coat and polished leather shoes looked out of place against the worn carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. "Mr. Rourke," Richard said, his voice less commanding than usual. "May I come in?" Jack hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, sir." The word "sir" felt strange now that he no longer worked for the man. Richard entered, removing his coat. His eyes swept the small living room, the second-hand furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the neat stack of library books on the coffee table. Emily's art supplies were arranged in colorful rows on a small desk by the window, her latest drawings pinned proudly to the wall. "Hi," Emily chirped from the kitchen. "I'm Emily. Would you like some hot chocolate? Dad makes the best hot chocolate." Richard's stern expression softened slightly. "Hello, Emily. That's very kind of you to offer." Jack stood awkwardly, unsure whether to offer the CEO a seat on their worn couch or one of their mismatched kitchen chairs. Richard solved the dilemma by remaining standing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Rourke, I'll be direct," Richard began. "My daughter gave quite a speech today, about you." Jack's chest tightened. He glanced at Emily, who had abandoned any pretense of doing homework and was watching them with undisguised interest. "Sophie has always been." Richard paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's always been more perceptive than me about certain things. People, mainly. I built this company focusing on numbers, efficiency, profit margins. Sophie sees the human element I often miss." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope. Jack's heart sank, thinking it might be some kind of formal notice or legal document. "She made me realize something today," Richard continued. "A company isn't just its bottom line. It's the people who stay late to fix broken heaters at homeless shelters. The ones who share their soup with crying strangers. The ones who teach new employees with patience and kindness." Emily beamed.
That's my dad. He makes the best soup too, not just hot chocolate. A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. Yes, I've heard about the soup. He held out the envelope to Jack. This is a job offer. Facilities manager position. Full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance. The salary is significantly better than your previous position. Jack stared at the envelope, not reaching for it. Sir, Dad, Emily squealed, bouncing in her chair. That means you can fix everything in the whole building. She's right, Richard said. We need someone who knows the building inside and out. Someone who understands both the technical aspects and the people who work there. Sophie helped me see that person is you. Jack's hands were steady as he finally took the envelope, but his voice wavered slightly. This is unexpected. Consider it a correction of my mistake, Richard said. I've been running this company like a machine when it should be run like a community. Sophie made that very clear today. He cleared his throat. Rather forcefully, in fact. Emily giggled. Sophie's nice. She always asks about my drawings when she visits Dad at work. Yes, she is, Richard agreed. And this time his smile was fuller, prouder. The position is yours if you want it, Mr. Rourke. We can discuss details tomorrow, but I wanted to offer it in person. Jack opened the envelope with careful fingers, scanning the contents. The salary figure made his eyes widen. It would more than cover Emily's medical expenses. The benefits package included everything they'd struggled to afford since his wife passed away. Emily couldn't contain herself any longer. She jumped up and ran to her father's side, peering at the paper. Does this mean we can stay? You don't have to work at the gas station anymore? Jack wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his throat tight. That's right, sweetheart. He looked up at Richard. Sir, I accept. Thank you. Richard nodded, reaching for his coat. Good. I'll have HR prepare the paperwork. Start Monday? He paused at the door. And Mr. Rourke? Sophie mentioned something about your chicken soup recipe being exceptional. Perhaps you could share it with the cafeteria staff. Yes, sir, Jack said, still somewhat dazed. I'd be happy to. Emily bounced on her toes. Can I come visit Dad at work sometimes? I promise to be quiet when he's fixing important things. I think that could be arranged, Richard said, his businessman's facade cracking into something warmer. Good evening, Mr. Rourke. Emily. As the door closed behind Richard, Emily launched herself into Jack's arms. Dad, you're going to be the best facilities manager ever! Jack hugged her tight, the job offer still clutched in one hand, hardly daring to believe how much had changed in the past few minutes. On their kitchen counter, a pot of soup simmered gently, just enough for 2 thermoses tomorrow. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he buttoned up his crisp navy uniform shirt in front of his bathroom mirror. The embroidered company logo gleamed silver against the dark fabric, and beneath it, his new title, Facilities Manager. He smoothed down the collar one more time, hardly recognizing himself. Dad, you look so fancy. Emily bounced on her toes in the doorway, already dressed for school in her favorite polka dot sweater. Her eyes sparkled with pride. Thanks, kiddo. Jack grinned, ruffling her hair. Ready for breakfast? After dropping Emily at school, Jack pulled into his usual spot in the employee parking lot. But today felt different. The weight of his new ID badge pressed against his chest pocket, a constant reminder that this wasn't just another morning. The security guard, Tom, did a double take as Jack approached the entrance. Well, look at you, Mr. Rourke, moving up in the world. Just Jack, Tom. Same as always. Jack felt his ears warm as he swiped his new badge. Inside, the morning shift was already bustling. Heads turned as he walked past, and instead of the usual polite nods, people stopped to congratulate him. Martha from accounting squeezed his arm. So deserved, Jack. The maintenance crew he'd worked alongside gave him thumbs up and playful salutes. There's our new boss, called Jerry, who'd been training under Jack for months. Don't forget us little people now that you've got an office with windows. Jack shook his head, chuckling. Like I could forget you guys. Who else would help me unclog the third-floor toilets? As he rounded the corner toward the staff lounge, a familiar scent of coffee wafted through the air. Sophie stood by the counter, 2 steaming cups in hand, wearing the warmest smile he'd ever seen. Good morning, Mr. Facilities Manager, she said, extending one of the cups. "Thought you might need this for your first day." "Thanks." Jack accepted the coffee gratefully. "Though I have to admit, this all still feels a bit surreal." Sophie leaned against the counter, her eyes twinkling. "Remember the first time we met in here? Me crying over my coffee? And you with your thermos of soup?" "How could I forget?" Jack took a sip of his coffee. "I thought you were just another intern having a rough day." "And I thought you were just a janitor with a kind heart." Sophie's voice softened. "Turns out we were both wrong, and both right, in a way. Your father—" Jack paused, still processing the events of the past few days. "He really surprised me." "He surprised himself, I think." Sophie smiled. "Sometimes people just need a little push to see what's right in front of them." The morning buzz of conversations and ringing phones filtered through the lounge as they stood in comfortable silence. Through the window, snow was beginning to fall again, but the heating system Jack had helped install last summer kept the room cozy. "Oh," Sophie suddenly remembered something. "Your office is ready. Want to see it?" Jack nodded, following her down the corridor. Staff members continued to call out congratulations as they passed. Each greeting made Jack's steps feel a little lighter, a little more confident. They stopped at a door with a fresh nameplate. Jack Rourke, Facilities Manager. Inside, the office was modest but well lit, with a desk, computer, and a small window overlooking the parking lot. Someone had placed a potted plant on the windowsill and hung a whiteboard on the wall. "The plant's from the maintenance team," Sophie explained. "And HR sent up all your paperwork already." She pointed to a neat stack on the desk. Jack ran his hand along the smooth desktop, remembering how many times he'd cleaned surfaces just like this one. Now he had his own to maintain. He shrugged off his winter jacket and hung it on the coat rack in the corner. "Ready to start your first day?" Sophie asked, lingering in the doorway. Jack straightened his badge, looking around at his new office, one more time. "Ready as I'll ever be." Somewhere in the building, a pipe rattled. Jack's ears perked up automatically, already mentally mapping the most likely source of the sound. Some things, he realized with a smile, wouldn't change, and he was perfectly fine with that. "Better check that pipe," he said, grabbing his tablet. "Duty calls." Sophie laughed. "Some things never change." "Thank goodness for that," Jack replied, heading out to face his first challenge as facilities manager, knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. The late winter sun streamed through the shelter's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the dining hall floor. Jack stood in the center of the room, surveying the work ahead with his contractor's eye. Drop cloths covered the worn tables, and paint cans lined the walls like patient soldiers waiting for duty. Emily sat cross-legged on a protected table, carefully organizing paintbrushes by size. Her inhaler rested beside her, but her breathing was steady and strong today. She hummed softly while she worked, a habit she'd picked up from her father. "The blue will make it feel more peaceful," Sophie explained, unrolling the design plans she'd drawn up. She'd traded her usual office attire for old jeans and a faded college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "And the warm lighting fixtures you found at that salvage yard will transform the space." Jack nodded, remembering how they'd spent last Saturday picking through architectural remnants. "Those brass pendants just needed a good polish. Emily, here is our expert shine master." "I made them sparkle like new," Emily beamed, holding up her hands that still showed traces of brass polish under her nails. The shelter's regular volunteers began filtering in, greeting the trio warmly. Over the past month, these Saturday morning sessions had become a highlight for all of them. Jack taught basic repair skills, Sophie coordinated supplies and schedules, and Emily charmed everyone with her enthusiasm and creative ideas. "Mr. Rourke," called Mrs. Martinez, the shelter's coordinator. "The primer's all dry from yesterday. We're ready whenever you want to start." Jack was about to respond when the front door opened, letting in a blast of cold air, and Richard Renshaw. The CEO stood awkwardly in his casual clothes, a hammer hanging from one hand. The room fell quiet. Sophie's eyes widened. "Dad? I didn't think you'd—" "Well," Richard cleared his throat, "you mentioned this project needed extra hands." He looked around the room, taking in the prepared surfaces and organized supplies. I used to do a fair bit of construction in college, summer jobs. Jack stepped forward, professional but warm. We could use help with the lighting fixtures, sir. Need someone tall to reach those ceiling mounts. A flash of relief crossed Richard's face at being given a concrete task. He nodded and set his tool belt on a nearby table. Sophie watched her father with a mixture of surprise and hope. The work began in earnest. Jack demonstrated proper painting techniques to the volunteers, showing them how to cut in edges cleanly and roll without leaving marks. The soft blue paint transformed the institutional walls into something gentler, more welcoming. Emily appointed herself quality control supervisor, carefully checking for missed spots and drips. She worked her way around the room, offering encouragement and juice boxes to the painters. When she reached Richard, who was carefully mounting a brass fixture, she held up a juice box without hesitation. "Thank you," Richard said, climbing down from his ladder. He took the offered drink with a small smile. "You know, your father's taught everyone here quite a lot about proper maintenance." Emily nodded seriously. "Dad can fix anything. He says everything deserves a second chance to work right." Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. He glanced at Jack, who was showing a teenager how to patch a small hole in the drywall, explaining each step with patience and clarity. The morning progressed steadily. Sophie worked alongside her father, holding the ladder steady as he installed each fixture. Their usual formality melted away as they fell into a rhythm, passing tools back and forth, problem-solving together when a mount proved tricky. "You seem happy here," Richard said quietly to his daughter as they worked. "More yourself than I've seen you in a long time." Sophie paused, wire strippers in hand. "I am, Dad. This helping people, working with my hands, making things better, it matters." Richard nodded, turning back to the wiring with focused attention. But Jack, working nearby, caught the respect in the CEO's expression as he watched his daughter confidently connect the final wires. By early afternoon, the transformation was nearly complete. The walls glowed a soft, calming blue, like a clear summer sky. Jack and Richard worked together to hang the last of the polished brass fixtures, their movements synchronized and professional. When Richard offered suggestions about the wiring configuration, Jack listened and incorporated the ideas smoothly. Emily and Sophie arranged the freshly cleaned tables back in place, positioning them to catch the best light from the new fixtures. The wooden surfaces gleamed from the loving attention of multiple volunteers armed with Murphy's oil soap and determination. Mrs. Martinez flipped the switches, and warm light flooded the room. The brass pendants cast gentle pools of gold across the tables, while new sconces created a welcoming glow along the walls. Gone was the harsh fluorescent glare of the old lights. The volunteers gathered in the center of the room, admiring their work. The space felt different, not just refreshed, but renewed, like it had been given its own second chance to work right. "This is beautiful," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice thick with emotion. "Our guests. They deserve this kind of dignity, this kind of care." Richard stood slightly apart from the group, his hands in his pockets. But his expression as he surveyed the room held genuine appreciation, not just for the improved aesthetics, but for the clear impact of the work. His gaze moved from the careful paint lines to the gleaming fixtures, then to his daughter's glowing face, and finally to Jack, who met his eyes with quiet confidence. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the brass fixtures and sending warm reflections dancing across the blue walls. Emily twirled in one of the light pools, her shadow spinning with her. "It looks like magic," she declared. No one could disagree. The dining hall had become more than just a place to eat. It was now a space that offered both physical and spiritual nourishment. A place where dignity and hope could flourish alongside the daily bread. Steam rose from the large pot on Jack's stove, carrying the familiar aroma of simmering chicken soup through their small apartment kitchen. Morning sunlight filtered through the window, catching the dancing vapor as it swirled upward. Emily stood on her step stool beside the counter, her dark hair tied back neatly in a pink scrunchie, watching intently as her father demonstrated how to properly dice a carrot. "Nice and even pieces," Jack explained, guiding her small hands with the kid-safe knife. "That way they all cook at the same time."
He smiled as Emily's tongue poked out slightly in concentration. The same expression her mother used to make when focusing on a task. "Like this, Dad?" Emily asked, proudly displaying her somewhat wobbly but earnest attempt at uniform carrot chunks. "Perfect, sweetheart." Jack gathered the orange pieces into a neat pile. "These will make the soup extra special, just like the batch that helped us make a good friend, remember?" Emily giggled, reaching for another carrot. "You mean when you gave your soup to Sophie because she was sad, and now she's not sad anymore?" "That's right." Jack stirred the broth, adding a pinch of herbs. "Sometimes the smallest kindness can make a big difference." The kitchen counter was covered with fresh vegetables, herbs, and containers they'd collected over the past week. Mrs. Peterson from down the hall had contributed several clean margarine tubs, and Mr. Martinez from the corner store had donated some proper soup containers when Jack mentioned their weekend plans. "Okay, time for the secret ingredient," Jack announced with theatrical seriousness. Emily bounced excitedly on her stepstool. "Love, just like you always say." "And a little extra pepper," Jack winked, making Emily laugh. He checked his watch, right on schedule. The soup would be ready just in time for their delivery rounds. As Emily carefully tore fresh parsley leaves from their stems, Jack reflected on how much had changed since that night in the office break room. One simple act of kindness had sparked a chain reaction that transformed not just his life, but created ripples through the whole community. "Dad, can I add the noodles now?" Emily asked, pointing to the package of egg noodles they'd picked up on sale. "Not yet, kiddo. Remember what happens if we put them in too early?" Emily scrunched up her nose. "They get all mushy and gross." "Exactly. Timing is everything with soup." Jack lifted the lid to check the simmering vegetables. "Just like your mom always said." A gentle knock at the door made them both look up. Emily's face lit up as she recognized the pattern. 3 quick taps, then 2 slow ones. "Sophie!" Emily called out, carefully climbing down from her stool. Jack wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find Sophie standing there with an empty basket and a bright smile. She dressed casually for their delivery mission in jeans and a cozy sweater. I smell something familiar," Sophie said, stepping inside and inhaling deeply. "Is this the famous soup that started it all?" "Dad's teaching me the recipe," Emily announced proudly, showing Sophie her carrot-stained fingers. "We're making lots extra for Mrs. Jenkins because she has a cold, and for Mr. Rodriguez because his grandson is visiting, and for Cleavers and for Molly and a place." "Slow down, sweetheart," Jack chuckled. "Let Sophie get her coat off first." Sophie hung her jacket on the hook by the door, her usual spot now, and rolled up her sleeves. "Well, as the original taste tester, I suppose it's my duty to make sure this batch meets the high standards of the first one." Emily nodded seriously. "Dad says you're our soup quality control person." "Oh, did he now?" Sophie raised an eyebrow at Jack, who shrugged with a grin. "Someone's got to maintain the standards," he said, stirring the pot. "Want to do the honors?" Sophie accepted the wooden spoon he offered, making a show of examining the soup's consistency before taking a careful taste. Emily watched with bated breath. Sophie tapped her chin thoughtfully. "The balance of flavors. The texture of the vegetables." She paused dramatically, making Emily giggle. "I'd say this batch is even better than the first one." "That's because I helped," Emily declared. "Must be," Sophie agreed, ruffling Emily's hair. "Now, what can I do to help?" For the next hour, they worked together in comfortable synchronization. Jack added the final ingredients while Sophie and Emily lined up containers on the counter. The radio played softly in the background. Oldies station, Emily's favorite, and the kitchen grew warm and cozy from the simmering pot. As they began ladling the soup into containers, Emily insisted on writing personal notes for each recipient. Her careful elementary school handwriting filled small cards with messages like, "Feel better soon," and "Hope you enjoy the soup." "Mrs. Rodriguez told me she keeps all your notes on her fridge," Sophie mentioned, securing another lid. "Says they brighten her whole kitchen." Emily beamed at this news, adding extra hearts to her current note. Jack watched his daughter and Sophie work side by side, their heads bent together as they decorated the final card. The scene felt so natural, so right, it made his throat tight for a moment. He busied himself with checking the containers were properly sealed. Everything's ready, Emily announced, placing the last note on top of its container. Can we use your pretty basket, Sophie? That's exactly why I brought it. Sophie held up the large woven basket she'd carried in. I figured we could fit at least 4 containers in here. They carefully packed the soup containers into Sophie's basket and 2 canvas bags Jack had ready. Emily insisted on carrying her own small bag with 2 containers, practicing walking carefully to avoid spilling. All set? Jack asked, doing one final check of the stove. Wait! Emily ran to the counter and returned with 3 paper cups. We forgot to taste test our own soup. Can't argue with that logic, Sophie laughed, accepting a cup. They stood in the kitchen, 3 cups of warm soup raised in an impromptu toast. To Dad's magic soup, Emily declared. To kindness, Sophie added softly, catching Jack's eye. To good friends, Jack finished, his voice warm. They sipped their soup together, Emily making exaggerated sounds that had Sophie giggling into her cup. The morning sun had grown stronger, promising a beautiful day for their deliveries. Ready to spread some soup cheer? Sophie asked, picking up the basket. Ready. Emily grabbed her bag, careful not to swing it. Jack collected the remaining bags and held the door open. The 3 of them stepped out into the crisp morning air, their laughter echoing down the hallway as Emily shared her plans for next week's soup variety. The company lounge was quiet in the late afternoon, bathed in the warm glow of sunset streaming through the large windows. Sophie sat at the corner table, her hands wrapped around a familiar blue thermos, steam rising from the chicken soup inside. Behind her, Emily's latest crayon masterpiece hung proudly on the bulletin board, a colorful drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Jack settled into the chair across from her, his new facilities manager badge catching the light. The lounge looked different now, cleaner and more welcoming since he'd implemented his building-wide improvements. But the memories of that first night, finding a crying young woman hunched over a cold coffee cup, remained crystal clear. You know, Sophie said, taking another sip from the thermos, this soup still tastes exactly the same as that first night. Her eyes crinkled with warmth. How do you manage that? Jack chuckled, running a hand through his graying hair. Trade secret. Though Emily's getting pretty good at making it herself now. He glanced at the drawing on the wall, his expression softening. Never thought a thermos of soup would change everything. It wasn't just the soup, Sophie said quietly. She set the thermos down, her fingers tracing its worn edges. It was the kindness behind it. You saw someone hurting and didn't hesitate to help, even though I was a complete stranger. Seemed like the right thing to do. Jack shrugged, but his eyes held a deeper understanding. When you're a single parent, you learn to recognize when someone needs a little care. Emily taught me that. Sophie nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where fat snowflakes had begun to fall. I was so lost that night. Trying to prove myself, desperate to show Dad I could handle the corporate world. She smiled ruefully. Instead, you showed me what really matters in a workplace. In life, really. Never thought the CEO's daughter would end up being my friend, Jack admitted with a small laugh. Nearly had a heart attack when I found out. Is that why you avoided me for 3 days? Sophie raised an eyebrow, grinning. Dad still feels terrible about the whole thing, you know. He mentions it at least once a week during our family dinners. Richard's not so bad once you get to know him, Jack conceded, thinking of their last volunteer session at the shelter. The CEO had spent 2 hours painting walls alongside everyone else, his expensive suit traded for old jeans and a t-shirt. He's learning. Sometimes you just need one person to care, Sophie said thoughtfully, wrapping her hands back around the warm thermos. One person to show you a different way of seeing things. Jack's eyes drifted to Emily's drawing again. The stick figures, clearly meant to be himself, Emily and Sophie, stood before what looked like the shelter building, surrounded by hearts and stars. His daughter had labeled it, "My family helps people." Emily's been asking when we're going back to the shelter, Jack mentioned, smiling at the artwork. She's got big plans for organizing their kitchen storage system. Says it needs the Emily touch. Sophie laughed, the sound bright and genuine. She's definitely your daughter, always finding ways to fix things, make them better. She paused, her expression growing more serious. You know, that's what you did for me that night.
Fix something I didn't even know was broken. Outside, the snow continued to fall, coating the world in a gentle blanket of white. The flakes danced past the window, catching the golden light of sunset, transforming the ordinary view into something magical. Jack watched them for a moment, remembering all the winters he'd spent worrying about heating bills and medication costs. Now, with his new position and benefits, those worries had eased considerably. "Thank you," Sophie said suddenly, her voice soft but firm. "Not just for the soup, but for showing me what real leadership looks like. What compassion in action means." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You're the one who stood up to your father in that board meeting. That took real courage." "Maybe," Sophie smiled. "But you're the one who taught me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be kind." She lifted the thermos in a mock toast. "To chicken soup and second chances." "To chicken soup," Jack agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And to friends who become family." Through the window, the snow continued its peaceful descent, each flake a tiny reminder of how life could change in the gentlest of ways. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and white, creating a moment of perfect stillness in the usually busy office building. In the comfortable silence that followed, Jack and Sophie sat together, watching the snow fall, each lost in thoughts of how a simple act of kindness had transformed not just their lives, but rippled outward to touch so many others. The thermos of soup sat between them, no longer just a container, but a symbol of the unexpected ways hope could arrive. Warm, nourishing, and right when you needed it most. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you thought this was just the beginning, you're right. Click through and see where the story takes you next. If you enjoyed the story of Jack Rourke, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.